Okay, we're gonna get started. In the last two lectures, we talked about cognition on a very theoretical level. So we talked about the theories of Piaget and Vygotsky. And then last week, we talked about the concept of information processing. Now we're going to start talking about various subforms of cognition on a little bit more of an applied level. So the first thing we're going to talk about is intelligence. So this particular lesson, we're going to apply something called the psychometric approach. And the psychometric approach to development, it measures in a quantitative way mental abilities. So IQ tests quantify intelligence. In the psychometric approach, where we're measuring and putting numbers to cognitive abilities, is different than what we've seen in the last couple slideshows, which were much more process-oriented. The psychometric approach is far more product-oriented. So let's define intelligence, and we're going to explain different ways to view intelligence and many different definitions of intelligence. But the standard definition of intelligence is the ability to solve problems and adapt and learn from everyday life experiences. And what determines a person's level of intelligence is going to depend on their age. So it's your mental age is dependent on your chronological age. So it's age dependent. That makes it a little bit more challenging to measure intelligence, but we have found ways to do this. So there are different theories that debate whether intelligence is one cluster of abilities or loosely related skills, which we're going to talk about. So let's start from the top. And the first person to create successfully an intelligence test was Alfred Binet. And Alfred Binet, the impetus for this was that he was hired by the French ministry to separate out children who could benefit from regular education and those who might need special education. And that was his task. And keep in mind that before the Industrial Revolution, many kids didn't go to school. They might have worked on farms. But around the time of the Industrial Revolution, there was a movement that pushed public education and the right for children to have access to education. And so we begin, right? So once you have a large number of people going into the school system, then you need to be able to identify those who are going to need more assistance than others. So he did. Alfred Binet worked with a colleague, Theodore Simon, and they came up with the first intelligence test called the Binet and Simon scale. And that was in 1905. So as I mentioned, Alfred Binet, he wanted to assign people to various classes based on their mental abilities, whether it be regular education or special education. And he felt that mental abilities included memory, judgment, abstract reasoning, and their test of general mental ability, as it was first called, was a 30-item test that it increased in its level of difficulty so that they could find a cutoff score for you. And what they did was they linked the question number to a child's age. So on average, let's say this is a hypothetical, a 7-year-old might get to question number 10. So if 7-year-olds on average got to question 10 of this IQ test, if a person got to question 10, we would give them a mental age of 7. But as you got older, we expected you to be able to go further and further along on this test. So your mental age was actually your performance on the test. And this test was highly successful at doing its job, and it became predictive of school performance. And it started to gain attention outside of France. And it actually went to 2 places. It went to Ellis Island, and there was the use of Binet's test to screen out immigrants at the turn of the last century. But it also went to Stanford University. And there was a researcher by the name of Louis Terman who was interested in gifted individuals and the long-term outcomes of gifted individuals. So he was looking for a test to study long-term outcomes in intelligence. So what did he do? He took Alfred Binet's test, modified it, reformulated it in a way that it could be useful for American school children. And then the test became known as the Stanford Binet test. Now it's interesting, the Stanford Binet test is what it's called today. And what that tells you is that even though Alfred Binet is not alive today, his contribution in this area was so great that he has a legacy, right? So you could easily change the name, but because Binet was influential, it remained Stanford Binet test. Now, what happened to Theodore Simon? Why wasn't it called the Stanford Binet Simon scale? I don't know, but Alfred Binet seems to be the primary figure here. Now, when we look at Binet's approach, he took a holistic view on intelligence. And what he did was he assumed that all these skills loaded on one set of abilities. Well, there is a statistical way to determine if that is true, and that's called factor analysis. So factor analysis is a fancy way of saying how do different questions or subtests load or link up with or correlate with a larger theme. So assuming that intelligence was a singular entity, all of these subtests should load onto that one ability. And to give you an example of factor analysis, things like vocabulary, verbal comprehension, verbal analogies, these are 3 different subtests, but they all are linked to verbal ability. So that would be the large factor, and the subtest in verbal abilities would be vocabulary, comprehension, and analogies. So Charles Spearman, he was an early statistician, and he worked on correlation. Now it's interesting, you may have heard of Spearman in statistics from Spearman Rowe. So it's the same guy. Now, Charles Spearman, he came up with what's called the 2-factor theory of intelligence. Now, Spearman's definition of intelligence said that there was G, or general ability, or a general factor, and then there was S, which was your abilities that were limited to specific tasks. Now, these 2 factors if you were to ask Spearman his definition, what is intelligence? He would say G plus S. Now, which one is linked to intelligence the most? The answer is G, right? So your general abilities or your general factor, that's useful in most situations. So that's going to be more predictive of intelligence than S, which was limited to specific tasks. So the G was considered central and supreme in terms of abstract reasoning. Now, Lewis Thurstone is another theorist who talked about intelligence, and he felt that intelligence, could be broken down even further, and he came up with 7 distinct primary mental abilities, which included verbal meaning, perceptual speed, reasoning, numerical ability, memory, word fluency, and spatial reasoning. And these primary abilities were predictive of intelligence. Now, how do you resolve the difference between Spearman's perspective and Thurstone's perspective? Well, we're going to talk about the 3-stratum theory of intelligence, which seems to put it all together pretty nicely. But we're not done yet. Raymond Cattell felt that intelligence had 2 factors beyond the G, or general ability. So Cattell focused on crystallized intelligence versus fluid intelligence. Now, when you hear the word crystallized, think solid, locked in, or accumulated knowledge. So when we talk about crystallized intelligence, these are sets of abilities that are acquired and accumulated through time. They tend to be heavily linked to vocabulary. Now, one criticism of crystallized intelligence is that crystallized intelligence is linked, because it's linked to vocabulary, it's also linked to culture. So there might be some biases when we talk about crystallized intelligence. And the second construct is what we call fluid intelligence. Now, fluid intelligence is more in flux, and it's more the ability to show mental rotations, or the ability to understand abstract concepts, logic, spatial reasoning, things of that nature. Now, it's interesting that mathematical abilities is linked to fluid intelligence, whereas verbal abilities are linked to crystallized intelligence. So a random factoid, there was a study that they explored Nobel Prize winners in the math and sciences, and they compared them to those who won a Pulitzer Prize for their writing. And what they tended to find was that those people who won the Pulitzer Prize tended to win the Pulitzer Prize for work that they did later in their career, whereas people who won the Nobel Prize for math and sciences, this tended to be for something they did earlier in their career. And it begs the question, why? Well, what we tend to see is that crystallized intelligence is fairly stable across the lifespan, whereas fluid intelligence, as you age, you tend to have some deterioration in functioning. So based on that principle, it should come as no surprise that if you have fluid intelligence that diminishes with age, that the math and sciences and the Nobel Prize that are won that rely heavily on fluid intelligence are going to be done for something typically earlier in one's career. So that's a random factoid. We also have John Carroll's work, as I mentioned, He's known for explaining the three-stratum theory of intelligence. And what he did was he took all the studies on intelligence and he wanted to see if he could put it together in one larger picture. And that's what he did. So he argues that there are three layers to this. And the top tier or layer is G, or general intelligence. So when we talk about Spearman and his view of general intelligence, well, that's there. Then you have your broad factors, right? That includes your fluid intelligence and your crystallized intelligence. Well, that is what we just talked about when we mentioned Cont'd. And then you had a whole bunch of primary factors, right? Those 7 primary factors, which were broad factors that were on display from Thurstone. And then we had specific abilities, G plus S. So the output of those broad primary factors are on the bottom row. So what I find brilliant about Carroll's three-stratum theory is that he attempts and does a pretty good job at reconciling debate. One person said the theory was X, another person said the theory was Y, and it turns out maybe each individual was correct, but was looking at it from a different vantage point. So now let's shift gears to another conceptualization altogether. Robert Sternberg. Now, Robert Sternberg has what's known as the triarchic theory of intelligence. Now, you may have heard of Sternberg in a personality theories class as well, because he also has the triangular theory of love. So he seems to break things down into 3 parts quite often. Interesting story, or at least this is how the story goes, is he was once asked the question, you know, you have these theories, the triarchical theory of intelligence and the triangular theory of love, you know, why is it that you conceptualize things as 3 interacting parts all the time? And he smiled and he said, that's a great question, and I'll give you 3 answers. To which the audience chuckled because, once again, a 3. But nevertheless, let's talk about his triarchical theory of intelligence. There are 3 parts. The first is what we call analytical intelligence, which is related to abstract reasoning and information processing that we've talked about in the previous 2 lessons, right? So that's your, you know, very, you know, basic intelligence, so to speak, that most people understand. But he said there are 2 other elements of intelligence as well. So there's creative intelligence, and creative intelligence is how you address novel situations, right? So when we think of creative intelligence, how do you solve novel problems? That's part of intelligence as well. And the belief is that the more you can apply the basic elements of information to novel situations, the more intelligent you are. And then thirdly, or finally, there's practical intelligence, which is our 3rd piece. And that's just what most people would call street smarts, right? So how do you navigate your everyday world? And I make a joke about this too, because I am a professor, but my sister is a law enforcement officer. And if I were to ask you, well, which intelligence do I rely on heavily, it would be analytical intelligence. And then if I were to ask you, well, which intelligence do law enforcement officers rely on heavily? It would be practical intelligence. So there's this difference between the element of intelligence that I use more than she does typically. So, but here's the question. If she and I were left in the woods in some random place, who's more likely to survive? She is, right? Because she has the practical intelligence. And I joke that I likely would be some animal's lunch pretty quickly because all that analytical intelligence doesn't help you when you're stuck in the woods. All right, necessarily. So that's Sternberg's triarchical theory of intelligence. Now, then we have Howard Gardner. Howard Gardner is an interesting fella because when he talks about intelligence, he believes, unlike all the previous theories where they're somehow overlapping or interplaying with one another or some subcomponents of the same intelligence, Howard Gardner believed that intelligence was not one thing. Rather, we had multiple separate, distinct intelligences. So he would reject the concept of the G that Spearman talked about. He would reject the idea of Cattell and Thurstone. He would reject Sternberg's theory and just say, well, each of these are distinct. So now he does believe that we have various abilities on all of these all of these distinct intelligences. So what are they? Well, the first two should sound fairly familiar with you. Linguistic intelligence or verbal abilities, and logico-mathematical abilities, that's your analytical intelligence. So these tend to be linked together. However, what Gardner felt was that if you only took these two, or spatial intelligence to some degree, these three, you would not have a proper measure of who's highly intelligent. There are people who might perform average on a traditional intelligence test, but be gifted in intelligence in other ways. So let's go through it. So linguistic intelligence of verbal abilities, occupations that rely heavily on linguistic intelligence would be journalists, speech writers, and so forth. Logical mathematical ability, these would be your accountants, your actuaries, and so forth. Musical intelligence, these would be your composers, these would be your lyricists, etc. Now, it's interesting. There are many people who present average, right? They present average on a traditional intelligence, but they're gifted in their lyrical ability. And then there are people who might actually be gifted and perform high on a traditional intelligence test. For example, Kanye West, right? Kanye West, it would not shock me if Kanye West scored high on a traditional intelligence test, as well as we all know he's gifted as a rap artist. But so the traditional definition of intelligence plus the musical definition, you can have both or one or the other. Now, spatial intelligence, you can think of the engineer who builds or constructs houses, or you can think of the plumber, the carpenter, and so forth, the roofer who relies heavily on spatial abilities, but may not have a formal level of intelligence or might score average, but could be very gifted at what they do. Bodily kinesthetic intelligence, this is This is related to the ability to move one's body through space. So athletes, dancers, individuals like that would be gifted in this regard. And, stereotypically, if you watch high school depictions of athletes, they present the stereotype, and I put that in quotes, of the dumb jock, right? So very good at sports, but not academically inclined. Well, that's not necessarily true, right? You have people who are athletes like Richard Sherman, right? A football player who's brilliant as well, would likely score very high on a traditional intelligence test, but is gifted at athletics as well. But there are some people who, when you hear them speak, you could see that, they're gifted at sports, but not necessarily academically inclined. Someone like Roger Clemens. And if you ever heard Roger Clemens testify before Congress related to steroids, listen to it, and it'll tell a story. But nevertheless, what Gardner would say is that traditional IQ test does not truly or completely measure Roger Clemens' intelligence. But for him, his intelligence is the decision on which pitch to use, the ability to take a ball and throw it through space. The naturalistic intelligence, these are related to nature, so your natural sciences, biochem, physics. Interpersonal intelligence and intrapersonal. Interpersonal is between people, so sales personnel. Intrapersonal is within oneself. And I know a lot of books refer to psychologists as in the interpersonal space, but I argue that in order to be an effective psychologist, you have to have intrapersonal intelligence. Now, Gardner, this is a breakdown of some of the things that he puts out there for his multiple intelligences. Now, Gardner started with 7 intelligences. On this slide, you see he added an 8th, right? And he proposed the 9th, which was spiritual intelligence. He never added it to his model, but he proposed it so clergy, spiritual leaders might have giftedness in there. Now, there was an individual by the name of David King who ran with that, and he created something called the CISRI, which is a spiritual intelligence scale. But can you think of a problem? Because Gardner is criticized pretty strongly about his theory. Can you think of a potential problem with this theory? Well, one problem with this theory is that some occupations rely on integrating multiple of these aspects. So let's take a visual spatial person. So let's take an engineer. An engineer, it's true that they need to have giftedness as it relates to understanding space and building a building or a bridge or whatever that might be. But there's also a lot of mathematics involved there. Same thing with an athlete, Steph Curry, right? Steph Curry, you would say that he's gifted in bodily kinesthetic intelligence. But what you're not taking into consideration is that he's using visuospatial intelligence as he navigates the floor and as he makes a decision who to pass to. And when he shoots, Steph Curry is one of the best shooters of all time based on the parabolic arc that he uses to shoot. Well, that's using geometry, which is mathematics. So one of the biggest criticisms of Howard Gardner is that these intelligences that he argues that are separate and distinct from one another actually are not as separate and distinct, so they're not separate intelligences. Another problem related to Gardner is that he violates the law of parsimony. Now, you probably have heard the law of parsimony in different ways. Perhaps you heard it as Occam's razor or Morgan's canon. These three things mean the same thing, but the concept is that usually the more assumptions you make, the more likely you are to err or make a mistake. So the theory that has the fewest number of assumptions or is the most simplistic is oftentimes the correct one because it has fewer assumptions. So when you say that you have 7 theories, 7 separate intelligences, well, you're assuming that each of the 7 are separate from one another. And then when you say, oops, my bad, I think they're actually 8, and then you add another one, right? That theory becomes very difficult to refute in the abstract, but violates a lot of the rules of science. So people like Gardner's theory because it basically says that everybody's unique and everybody has their own intelligence that makes them gifted. And I'm going to say that what Gardner was measuring wasn't intelligence, because I land on the traditional definition of intelligence more than his theory of intelligence. But I'm going to argue that he was describing skills or abilities, but he wasn't describing intelligence. So you can be skilled while your general intelligence is at a different point than that skill set, so to speak. So how do we measure intelligence? Well, there are different ways we can measure intelligence. And there are group administered tests and there are individually administered tests. If you take the history of psychology, you'll learn about Yerkes and Walter Dill Scott. And each of these psychologists, they focused on creating tests that could be administered in a group fashion. So the question is, well, why would you want to give a group administered intelligence test? Well, that's when time is of the essence. So Robert Yerkes in particular came up with the Army Alpha and Beta tests. And that test was meant to screen out recruits to determine which position or specialty they should be in, whether they should be on infantry, whether they should be in intelligence or intel, whether they should be in support services like being a cook. And this was done, Yerkes' test was done during World War I. So when you're sending massive amount of people to war and you have a draft and you're screening a large number of recruits, you don't have the time to sit with each of them for an hour and a half to determine who's what. So a group administered test might be better. Now, these tests tend to require little training. They tend to be very overly simplistic. And one challenge with that is that they're easy to fake. And there are some people who faked the alpha and beta tests to avoid having to go to the military. But so that's group administered IQ tests. But the vast majority of IQ tests are done on an individual level. And they require a lot of training. So if you were to go to graduate school to get a master's in school psychology or a doctorate in school clinical or counseling psychology, you would have to take courses on assessment. And before you finish your program, you would have a minimum of 3 semesters on assessment. And 1 whole semester focuses on cognitive tests. So you have to have expertise and training. And then before you get your doctoral degree, you have to go and have a clinical rotation. So you have your practicum and your internship, and most states require a postdoc as well. So you put that together, and one of the major areas that you're going to be doing is psychological testing. So all of this before you get your license, and you could be on your own, but that gives you the competency and expertise in individually administered tests. So unlike group administered tests, they tend to require a lot of training and expertise. So the first of which I mentioned was the Stanford Binet intelligence test. This intelligence test has 5 sub-factors or 5 factors, 10 sub-tests. And you can use this test for individuals the age of 2 all the way through adulthood. And this was the first IQ test, and it was the gold standard in IQ testing until the Wechsler test surpassed it. So one nice thing about the Stanford Binet, which makes it a culture fair test, even though people who are native English speakers tend to do a little bit better, is that the Stanford Binet test now includes both verbal and nonverbal components. Because what you're going to see is that there are cultural biases on the verbal components, whereas the nonverbal components tend to be far less biased. All right. So along comes David Wechsler, and then you have your Wechsler test. So the Wechsler test, and forgive me, they've been updated since the slideshow. So we're now in the WISC 5. But the Wechsler test, one thing that Wechsler did was he said, it's crazy that the Stanford Binet has one test from 2 years old all the way to late adulthood. So he decided to work on 3 separate tests. There is the WISC, which is on this slide, the WIPSI, and the WACE. So the WIPSI is for preschool children, and that's for ages 2 to 6. The WISC is for 6 to 16, and the WACE is for 16 plus. Similar to the Stanford Binet, there is both a verbal and a nonverbal component. And because it's more nuanced, it also gave more space to differentiate abilities between native English speaking and non-English speakers to identify personal and normative strengths. So, as I said, in addition to the WISC, there's the WIPSI and the WACE, and there is their age range. Now it says until about 7, because the WIPSI goes from 2 years old, 0 months, to 6 years old, 11 months. So that's what I mean by about. And it's cultural fair as opposed to culturally biased, because we know that verbal components have some advantage, but it was tested to be roughly fair across ethnicities. That doesn't mean entirely we've eliminated cultural biases, because if you ask, well, who was Martin Luther King? That kind of question, which could appear on an information subtest, well, if you're part of the, if you're a native US born individual, you're going to know more of American history than someone who migrates to the United States on average. So that's culturally loaded in that way. All right. So we also want to distinguish between aptitude and achievement tests. Aptitude measures potential, achievement measures previously acquired knowledge. So IQ tests tend to be more linked to aptitude, whereas if I give you a quiz or a test, that tends to be more linked to achievement. All right. So you'll notice that both the Stanford Binet and the Wechsler test start intelligence at 2 years old or later. And the question becomes, well, what if you had to measure intelligence beforehand? Are there any instruments that could measure intelligence earlier than the Stanford Binet and the Wechsler tests? And the answer is yes. So the Bailey scales of infant development is a very commonly used infant intelligence test. And you might ask yourself, well, why would a person want to test intelligence in infancy? Well, if a child is nonverbal or at 18 months, or they're demonstrating some kind of cognitive delay or linguistic delay, you might want to identify that early so you can engage in early intervention to treat it. So that's one reason. Or if you are concerned about anoxia, which we talked about prenatal development, what happens if you're concerned about lack of oxygen to the baby? That could affect cognition as well. So there are times you might assess intelligence in infancy, and we need an instrument to do it. That instrument is the Bailey scales. All right, so the two components are mental abilities and motor abilities. It's interesting to note that the motor abilities you can identify earlier, and then the mental abilities become more complex as you get older. So mental abilities include starting with sensory and perceptual abilities, such as identifying a sound, looking at a fallen object, and then as you get older, some building blocks, cubes, identifying pictures with language, and then the motor abilities start with grasping, sitting, jumping, drinking from a cup. So now let's talk about IQ. You might have heard intelligence referred to as IQ, which that stands for intelligence quotient. Well, IQ was based on Stern's formula. So Stern's formula was mental age divided by chronological age times 100. And if you do that, instead of just saying, oh, you're 7 years old, you perform at the 8-year-old level, you could do a whole number to reflect intelligence. And when you do that, if you were equal to your age group, then the average intelligence would be 100, and a standard deviation would be 15. So we talk about a normal distribution or a bell curve. And in order to be atypical, and the word atypical is not necessarily a bad thing. You could be atypical in a good way too. But in order to be atypical, you need to be 2 standard deviations away from the mean. If you are 2 standard deviations above the mean, that would be an IQ of 130 or above. We would consider you gifted or a genius. If you had an IQ 2 standard deviation below the mean, that's an IQ of 70 or lower, then we would consider you, assuming you have functional deficits as well, to have an intellectual disability, which we used to call mental retardation. So the next question. So we talked about IQ, we talked about measuring IQ. Is IQ stable? So if I give you an IQ test now, and I give you an IQ test in 5 years from now, will your IQ be roughly the same? That's what correlational stability is linking the scores. Are they the same or are they very similar? Well, what did researchers find as it relates to this? Now, this question goes back to lecture 1, where we had a debate whether in development things remain stable or whether they change across the lifespan. But here, as we apply it to IQ, we found 2 patterns. The first thing is that the older you are at the first IQ testing, the more stable the IQ is at the second testing, or the more it predicts later IQ. Why? Because smaller differences can make you stand out in one way or another as a toddler, as an infant, and then in middle childhood. So as you get older, your IQ tends to become more stable. And then we talk about the two, as you have a shorter distance between the testing, the more similar or stable IQ is. So the closer they are to one another, the more stable it is. All right. Now, so when we talk about stability, we also have to think about the environment, because if the environment fluctuates in a meaningful way, that could alter the stability of IQ. So we talk about this concept of environmental cumulative deficit hypothesis. So what happens with people who are in underprivileged living conditions? Well, they tend to perform poorer than people who are more advantaged or more privileged. Keeping that person in an underprivileged situation exacerbates the situation. So the longer you are in an unprivileged situation, the worse the IQ is, and the less stable IQ can be. So it's important to understand not just what's happening inside a person or an organism, but think about the environment as well. All right. Now, what does IQ predict? Well, we see that IQ is a very good predictor of academic performance. And in fact, IQ predicts achievement better than any other measure. Now, how about occupational attainment? Once again, we see that IQ predicts performance in the workforce. Now, does that mean that it's the only predictor? No. We talked about from Sternberg the concept of practical intelligence. So people might perform better than IQ predicts because of practical intelligence. So interest matters. Real world abilities matters just as much as this abstract concept of IQ. How about psychological adjustment? Well, IQ and mental health are unrelated. That's what we see. So let's talk about factors correlated with mental health, though. In general, people who have higher IQ tend to be liked by their peers. They tend to serve as models. So there's more of a social inclusion versus a social exclusion. So that could predispose a person for better psychological adjustment. We also see that people with lower IQ tend to be at risk of school failure. They tend to have greater levels of delinquency. And they show greater levels of aggression. So, and that might be due to frustration, not that the IQ is predicting it. But when we talk about mental health, things like anxiety disorders, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, you've been told a myth that the more intelligent you are, the wackier you are. That's not really true. There's no linkage between IQ and psychological disorders in this regard. However, the flip side is true too. Being intelligent doesn't mean you're going to be happier either. Now, we do see differences in socioeconomic status and ethnicity in IQ. We tend to see whites and Asian Americans tend to perform higher on IQ than Blacks and Hispanics. Now, the question is, how is that possible? What's going on there? Well, there is the nature-nurture debate. There was a highly controversial book called The Bell Curve that suggested that the abstract reasoning abilities of ethnic minorities was inferior to whites. That has now been debunked. But there was a time when the Bell Curve was a popular book and people believed that whites were inherently more intelligent than blacks. But when you put things into the mix, things like socioeconomic status, that tells a story as well. So socioeconomic status has three parts: years of education, prestige or status of one's job, and income. And we boil it down to income typically, but there's more to that. But we tend to find that middle and upper class individuals tend to outperform those people who are working class or low income. Well, that tells a story as when we look an intersection between ethnicity and socioeconomic status, we tend to see that there's an overrepresentation of blacks and Hispanics who are in lower income brackets. And that's going to disadvantage them on IQ tests. So the Bell Curve, who argues for genetic differences, ignores all the environmental factors. So here's just a breakdown of what we typically see. We typically see on average that there's about a 15 IQ point difference in white children versus black children, although that difference is shrinking as we create social programs to address some of the inequities of society. We see Hispanic individuals tend to fall somewhere in between blacks and whites, and then we see Asian Americans tend to be a few points higher than the previous three. So that creates the discussion. Now, we talked about the Bell Curve. Here's a cognitive psychologist, Arthur Jensen, who pushed for this, right? So the level 1, level 2 theory of intelligence. Level 1 intelligence is associative abilities, things like short-term memory, digit span, things like that. Arthur Jensen said there were no significant differences between whites and blacks, or whites and other ethnic groups, I should say. But when it came to level 2 intelligence or conceptual intelligence, which required abstract reasoning, verbal ability, spatial abilities, whites tended to outperform ethnic minorities on average. So he argues that it's genetic. So when we take Arthur Jensen's theory and the Bell Curve, these research studies could be used, misused, or dare I say abused by racist or white supremacists. So why don't we take a closer look at the data and see if it's truly just genetic, right? So if these differences in IQ are truly just genetic. So let's start with kinship studies. So kinship studies, kinship is your relative, familial, or genetic relationship. So how closely you are related on a genetic level. So if we look at this graphic, I think it tells a beautiful story. I think it tells you the story of both nature and nurture. So let's look at the first of each two pairings. So if we were to look at number 1 to number 3, 3 to 5, 5 to 7, and so forth, what we tend to see is the genetic similarity in IQ of identical twins is much greater than fraternal twins. And we tend to see that fraternal twins' IQ is much more similar than non-twin siblings, and then unrelated siblings or adopted children. So as the genetic similarity gets lower, we tend to see a drop-off in the correlation of IQ. So, but now let's compare the first in its group to the second in its group, because we just talked about identical twins, fraternal twins. Now let's compare what happens when they live together in the same house versus raised apart. So if we were to look at 1 versus 2 and then 3 versus 4 and so forth, it tells another story. So identical twins reared together, you have a correlation upward of 80% or a 0.8, pardon me. Whereas reared apart, it's upward of 0.7. So being raised together in identical twins shifts the correlation up about 0.1 more. So the environment, merely being raised together, is going to increase the correlation between the two. Being raised apart, having separate environments, can also drop off the IQ. And whether we look at 1 versus 2 or row 1 versus row 2 or row 3 versus row 4 with fraternal twins, we see the same thing. It's about 0.55, then it drops off when they're reared apart to 0.35 roughly, and then the same pattern continues to go. So what I like about kinship studies is that it tells the story of both nature and nurture. So when someone says IQ is inherited exclusively, right? So eugenicists believe this. It's wrong. So the first data point that demonstrates that both nature and nurture come together are kinship studies. We could also look at identical twins and fraternal twins, right? And watch them across time. So let's look at nature and nurture with identical versus fraternal twins. So if we take identical twins and follow them through time, the correlation seems relatively stable. Once again, if you look at the mustard color or orange color, that shows the genetic piece. But if you look at the red, which depicts fraternal twins, through time, the correlation drops off. And you might ask yourself, well, why is it that identical twins, the correlation increases a little bit or stays relatively stable, but with fraternal twins, it drops off? So research suggests, Magoo and colleagues found that fraternal twins tend to find their own niche. And through niche picking, they don't use each other as much as their friend group. They find their own friend group, which creates greater differences in their environment, which affects their IQ. So once again, identical twins represents the nature side of the argument. Fraternal twins in this case represents the nurture side of the argument. And we could also look at adoption studies. And the interesting thing about studying intelligence through adoption studies is that you have two sets of parents. You have biological parents who put you up for adoption, and then you have the parents who raise you. And the question is, well, what is the correlation between the biological mother and the child who was adopted? So let's see what happens. So one of the studies by Sandra Scar was this Texas adoption study. And what she found was that if you had a parent that had an IQ of 120 or more, meaning that they were gifted, and that child was adopted into another home, that child tended to perform fairly consistent with their biological parent and their IQ. So it was relatively stable. So that would be on the right side of this graph in red. Once again, that's the nature side of the argument. Whereas if you had a child whose biological mother had an IQ of 95 or lower, so average IQ or low average, then they were adopted into another family, the IQ spiked up to over 100. So taking a child and putting them in a middle to upper class family, a stable emotional family, that tended to increase the IQ of this child. So the 95 or below, the IQ changed for the better based on the environment. So that would be the nurture side of the argument. Nature and nurture work together for IQ. Other things to talk about when we talk about nature, you might talk about genetics, and there's an interesting finding about race and ethnicity. Is it a genetic factor? Is it a cultural grouping? Well, from a DNA point of view, we find fewer number of genetic variations with, fewer number of genetic variations between ethnic groups than within ethnic groups. So the whole argument, even at the genes level, is kind of flawed. Now let's shift purely to nurture, the environment and how it affects IQ. I'd like to talk to you about something called the Flynn effect. If we were to look at IQ, compare your IQ relative to your parents' IQ, relative to your grandparents' IQ, and we follow you through time, we tend to see people are performing better in IQ through time. So how is it possible that you're on average smarter than your parents or have higher IQ than your parents or your grandparents? That doesn't make sense. And no matter which country you go to, in industrialized nations, we see this increase. Well, the answer is simple. The environment changed. We have greater emphasis on education, improved nutrition, technological advances, culture has shifted to focus on test-taking motivation. All of these things predispose you to perform better in IQ than your parents. So that's an purely environmental fact. Now, I do want to go back. So where are we? We started talking about Arthur Jensen and the genetic loading of IQ. And then we showed kinship studies, we showed longitudinal studies, we showed adoption studies, we showed research on the Flynn effect, which challenges the notion of IQ being purely genetic. Another issue when you think about this difference in IQ is that it's possible that IQ tests have some form of a test bias. And when we think of IQ tests, they could either be culture free, culture fair, or culturally loaded. When you have a culture free test, there's no emphasis on culture whatsoever. So a lot of the nonverbal IQ tests tend to be culture free. The Wechsler test, we said, was culture fair. What does that mean? Culture is part of the test, but it doesn't heavily bias your overall IQ. And then we have culturally loaded tests, which predispose one group to perform better than another group. All right. So we talk about test bias, and we find that traditional IQ tests are predispose individuals who have middle to upper class socioeconomic status, ethnic majority cultures, people have previous exposure to the language and verbal customs of the test to perform better. And so when we look at this might be another reason why ethnic minorities perform poorer on IQ tests. So let's look at language customs. When we look at language customs, most school-age children are trained to be topic focused. And if you've ever written an essay in middle school, they tell you set the plot, have some kind of crisis, have a climax, or some kind of conflict, and a climax and a resolution. So it builds to a high point and resolves itself in a linear way. Well, the language customs of African Americans they, when they speak or tell stories, they don't build stories in that plot fashion. Many African American children uh, do what's called topic associating stories, which is linking similar experiences. So instead of building one story could lead to a second story with the same or similar experience, which could lead to a third story with a same or similar experience. So, what does that do? It's a difference between depth versus breadth. And these topic focused formulas bias language in favor of the Caucasian majority. So, what are the factors, social factors, environmental factors that drive performance? Well, one factor is poverty. Another factor is support from family and community. Another factor is parental involvement. And a final factor is cultural beliefs about academic achievement. Variability in any one, let alone all of these factors, could impact a person's IQ test or intellectual development. So we don't want to just say, well, this is purely genetics, because there's environmental influences that affect the intellectual development. And then there was Claude Steele. Claude Steele talked about this theory called stereotype threat. Now, what is the concept of stereotype threat? Stereotype threat is that if you know a stereotype about your group, or you feel that you're being judged based on a stereotype, you don't even have to believe the stereotype for you to be affected by the stereotype. So if you were to think about stereotypes between males and females, there might be a stereotype for males and females that somehow females are less competent in mathematics. Research suggests that's not true. Both males and females perform roughly the same in terms of mathematics. However, the stereotype is there. So Claude Steele did a study where he had males and female math majors take math tests. And in one case, it was just described as a fun activity and just do the best you can. And in another one, it was a measure of mathematical abilities. And what did he find? Only when women were told it was a measure of their mathematical abilities did they actually differ from males in an inferior way. When males and females were told this was just a fun activity, they didn't differ much from one another. All right. So same thing can be said about ethnicity and IQ, with this stereotype that somehow the white superiority myth of IQ, it also affects ethnicity. And sure enough, Blacks and Hispanics underperform when they're told it's a measure of how good you are at school problems and whatnot. So once again, the stereotype about one's group can influence performance. So how do you address some cultural bias in testing? Well, you could focus on the process instead of the product. Like, if you're not just an IQ score. You could give feedback and encouragement after each task, and you could emphasize the adult-child relationship to shape development. Now, we mentioned mental development or IQ development and the environment. Well, if you wanted to measure how similar or dissimilar a person's environment or quality of their home life is, you could use the instrument home observation for measurement of environment, called HOME, and that will talk to you about the environmental factors that impact IQ. So the more similar siblings are in having high scores or positive scores on the home, so to speak, the better IQ is going to be. The more different the scores are, the differences there are going to be in IQ. Now, I talked about non-shared environmental influences. One thing that's interesting is people put a lot of emphasis on birth order. We find that birth order has minimal effect on personality and IQ. All right, so what do you do when you see someone who's struggling? Well, there are different programs that were designed to help individuals who are disadvantaged. So Head Start programs, pre-K, UPK or 3K, all of these programs in America are designed to, as a social intervention, an early intervention for families that are economically disadvantaged, so that in addition to getting education, they get nutritional services, they get health services, so that by the time children enter the classroom in kindergarten or first grade, they start out roughly the same. Parents are part of the process too. So all of a sudden you're building an infrastructure around the children. Now, here's the deal though. We Head Start and UPK and all that stuff once you go to school. Well, I think that's a mistake, because when you remove Head Start, you're removing the support beams, the structure that eliminates the disadvantage. But these individuals are economically disadvantaged, they're going to regress. That's what we tend to see on average. Now, we have something called Project Head Start in Canada. There's Aboriginal Head Start, which was focused on the Indigenous Native of Canada. Now, what do we see? What's the benefit of Head Start? Well, it improves IQ. It helps academic performance in earlier school age years. And even though after a while, this bump in academic performance drops off during the school age, we tend to see that individuals who had Head Start are more socially adjusted, they perform better, they're less likely to be left behind, and they perform better in adulthood than their counterparts who did not have Head Start. So it helps on a cognitive level with IQ, it helps on an academic level for a while, and then the phenomena disappears, but it also helps on a social level. So Head Start is important. So we talked about IQ. Now let's talk about giftedness and creativity. So you might have heard the term gifted and talented. What does it mean to be gifted? A gifted individual tends to have exceptional IQ or intellectual strength. Now, people who are gifted tend to be very quick to do their academic work. They solve problems fairly quickly and effectively. They have great memories that helps them apply from one task to another, and they have very good problem solving skills. So that's what it means, or some hallmark features. Now, what is creativity? So people who are gifted tend to be more creative, right? So creativity is the ability to show originality. That's what creativity is. Now, but creativity also requires you to be appropriate or socially appropriate, right? So you come up with novel solutions, but are useful or socially appropriate as well. So in order to measure this, we have to talk about both divergent and convergent thinking. Convergent thinking is, coming to a single correct answer. That's convergent thinking. And we are taught to say, well, what is the answer to this question? And creative people don't think of things as what is the answer to the question. They think in terms of what is a possible answer. Because in most things, there's more than one answer. So if I were to pose a question to you, something like, well, what causes depression? That is actually not a very good question, because there are many factors that could lead to depression. There's genetics, there's home life, there's hormone levels, there's a whole bunch of different things that could drive it. So if you're looking for a single answer, you're not going to get a fuller picture. So divergent thinking is to be able to think outside of the box, come up with a unique answer or unusual possibility. When everyone's thinking or going left, you go right. So these are all what we're talking about here. So we emphasize novelty and we build creativity using novelty. So you want to have children pursue some new project that allows them to come up with a final solution or a unique solution. So, but in order to be creative, in order to have that novelty, you have to have certain cognitive abilities. So one is you have to have problem finding. If you don't identify a problem, you can't come up with a solution. You have to identify the scope of the problem. So define what are the parameters of the problem. You have to understand, well, what do everyone else think? Are there other ways of seeing it? So both divergent and convergent thinking, you have to evaluate competing ideas and so forth. In terms of personality, you have to be able to tolerate uncertainty, ambiguity. You have to be able to have perseverance. You have to be able to deal with failure. You have to be willing to take risks, and you have to have the courage of your conviction. So, and in terms of motivational factors, you focus on the task rather than the goal. So we talk about intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is to do something for its own sake, whereas extrinsic motivation is to do it for a reward. You want to be more task focused rather than goal focused. You want to be more internal locus of control or intrinsic motivation versus external locus of control or trying to get some secondary gain. And then in terms of environmental resources, sometimes it's hard to be gifted. You might have some social isolation, but that actually doesn't bother many gifted kids because, you know, they have more time to think, more time to do things their way rather than trying to conform. But in terms of gifted individuals, we're starting to see the effect of giftedness on self-esteem. And that, my friends, is the lecture for today. So I'm going to stop here and then we'll continue next week.